Behind the Beer, where we introduce you to the people that make beer happen. I'm Aaron Gore, and I'm joined today by Bryan Roth. Bryan, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me, man.
Oh, happy to have you on. So, Bryan, for people who aren't as familiar with your work, you are the Sightlines editor for Good Beer Hunting, which is one of the most well-known, most well-regarded beer websites out there. Can you tell us a little about what being the Sightlines editor really means and kind of the role that you play over there?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for those kinds words. Very much appreciate it. It's something that we strive for a lot, to try to have a good voice and important takes and share good information with the community. So I've been writing with Good Beer Hunting for about 3.5 years, I believe. My history covering the industry goes a little further than that, but I shifted from a role as just a regular contributor, writing news stories, essays, and kind of deeper dives into my role currently as editor for Sightlines. Gosh, about 1.5 years ago. In Sightlines, while Good Beer Hunting, I always describe it as kind of a digital magazine because we have a lot of long form pieces that include really beautiful photography and kind of do these intense and really delightful narratives of either places or businesses or people who are involved in and around beer. Sightlines is kind of the complete opposite of that. Sightlines represents our daily and weekly news coverage. So that is when something happens in the news industry or in the beer industry, that news breaks. That's something that we're hopping on with Sightlines. And I kind of manned that by myself for quite some time before stepping into my editor's role. And now I share writing responsibilities on Sightlines with Kate Burnett, who handles kind of the main Sightlines material. And then I shifted into an editorial role that also included the Sightlines premium section, which for the last few months has really been all COVID all the time. And that content
that and pretty much everything else in the world.
That's very true. even I was joking with Kate just today about how it would be nice if we're talking about a non-COVID story and how normal that feels all of a sudden. But the Sightlines premium stuff is it's been free during these last couple of months just because we felt it's really important information, data about the industry, analyzing trends. It will be going back to its previous model. It was a paywall service for people in the industry to kind of get these important insights that help to ultimately make business decisions.
I can always tell somebody who has experience either writing or doing some sort of, video podcasting experience because they make my job very, very easy. So we're going to skip forward a little bit.
Happy to help.
Speaking of podcast experience too, you don't just act as the Sightlines editor for GBH. You also are one of the hosts of their podcast, which that gets a few views or a few listens rather for you guys as well. So how did you kind of transition into that role? And you find there's some major differences between writing in long form format or writing articles versus hosting a podcast, and especially in that interview format you do so much of?
Yeah, there's a very specific reason actually why I do the podcast. I think it was 2018, February 2018. I got invited to go to Iceland to go cover an annual beer festival that they have to celebrate the end of beer prohibition. So the country
had
a
good festival to have.
It's in the middle of February, which I wrote a story about it. And I think the way I describe it in the opening of it is how schizophrenic the weather feels. Because in that moment in time, when I was there, it would snow, feet of snow in the morning. Then the skies would clear and the sun comes out and you shed all of your coats and you're walking around your jeans and your sweater. And it was both wonderful and frightening at the same time. But when I went to this festival, I had been writing for Good Beer Hunting for some time. And Michael Kaiser, the creative director and founder of Good Beer Hunting, he said, why don't you just take some podcasting equipment with you just in case you're able to chat with people? Because this, the purpose of this festival, it's hosted by this hostel / high-end brew pub called Kex. And so the guys behind the organization, they travel the world and they kind of get all of like their biggest and favorite breweries. So when I was there, I think it was like Boneyard from Oregon. Other half was there. Some McKellar was there. So like a lot of big, well-known breweries. And so I had the equipment with me just in case I was able to chat with people. And at the time, I think one of the first people I met when I landed in Reykjavik was Kai Leskowitz from Aslan in Virginia, which has gone on to kind of get quite a bit of acclaim in the hazy IPA game.
Pretty well recognized name at this point.
Yeah. That
and in
was
good
really
company,
wonderful.
It sounds like.
Yeah, and it was actually really nice because Kai, I ended up chatting with him a couple times, and I've been lucky enough to continue that friendship since too. He's a really great guy. And so I after that I kept the podcasting equipment, and so it turned into this thing where it was kind of my road show because Michael in Chicago has the official studio set up.
And that's the editor-in-chief of Good Beer Hunting.
Correct. Yeah. And so he was the one who had started the podcast. And that was, when people were coming through Chicago, it being such a huge beer hub, they'd come to the studio and he'd actually have them in a proper sit down setting where they have an actual setup. Whereas with me, I've got my Zoom recorder, a couple of travel mics, audio quality is really great. But it's like, I'm just schlepping it wherever I go and I travel around. So that's kind of been my status quo for the last couple of years. It's basically, I'll do stuff around here where I live in Durham, North Carolina, not far from you. And so I've done a lot of interviews with people in the immediate area, including in Charlotte. But basically, if I'm traveling to a new place, I'm bringing the podcast equipment with me just to try to kind of get these oral stories as I'm going around the country and world.
And I think that plays into another aspect of what you do, not only for Good Beer Hunting, but just your involvement in the beer industry. You do quite a bit of beer traveling. I think just this year, I think you've been in Texas speaking not that long ago. Been all over.
That was right before COVID. That was actually as COVID was spreading. I was in Austin for the Texas Brewers Guild annual conference. This was the very last couple of days of February, 1st of March. And I think it was the third or fourth day that I was there. The first COVID case showed up in San Antonio. And that was the last time I left the state of North Carolina.
Well, that was well timed. I was actually supposed to be in Austin 2 weeks ago. So thank you for rubbing that in. So you've gotten the opportunity to travel quite a bit for your beer writing. You've gotten the opportunity to write for a major beer website, to host a podcast. But you kind of got your start doing this with a blog, correct?
Yeah. 2011, I think it was.
So coming up on 10 years almost.
Yeah, it's really funny to look back on it. And because to me, there's this direct through line from kind of where I started to where I am today with the coverage and what I do with Good Beer Hunting. My background is originally in journalism. I studied journalism and worked in newspapers in college and immediately after. And I moved to North Carolina in 2008. Which wasn't too long after the Pop the Cap movement. And so kind of, as the ABV level rose in North Carolina, it really changed the dynamics of what was going on with the beer culture in the state. So I kind of got here as things were really ramping up and taking off. And I remember Full Steam had been planning in Durham for like a year and a half or 2 years. And then they opened, I think it was 2010. And everything just kind of like built up to this head. And I had enjoyed beer, but really didn't think about it too critically. And around that time, my State Farm agent here in Durham, I kept on running into him at beer festivals in Durham and Raleigh. And so it was like we'd say hello, we recognize each other, we chat real quick. And the third time it happened, we figured, okay, so let's actually like hang out for a little bit. He was a home brewer. So I started homebrewing with him. That got me into beer, and that led to the eventual launch of my blog called This Is Why I'm Drunk.
Good name and appropriate.
Yeah, I always gave the caveat. It's like, and I think I had it in my about page. It's like, I'm not drunk while I write this, I promise. And if
I don't know, I've seen
drunk,
some of the spelling and grammar on those early ones.
Everyone needs an editor, though, right?
Oh yeah, it helps. You're the editor now, so you know more better than most.
But I used it originally as I think a lot of people, it seems strange, like 2010 to 2012, there are a lot of these blogs that are popping up. And I met a lot of people who I consider close friends now because of it. And it started out as like, it was just beer reviews. it's such an easy entry point for people who maybe want to write about beer and just kind of a fun hobby. And that's just the easy way to ease into it, because you're maybe saying those things out loud. It tastes like bubble gum, or, this
And
is
for most people too.
wet blanket.
That's their first experience with beer, is as a consumer and as somebody.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the blog started as, it was just kind of like a log for me to track. It was my early Untapped, is I was tracking kind of my thoughts. I'd have a picture, and then
have you hit those guys with the cease and desist yet?
I should have. Greg, you're on my list.
Careful, they got big lawyer money now.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll see.
They're good guys. We love you. Yeah. They're based out of Wilmington. They're our neighbors as well.
It started out as kind of that, and I was writing about home brewing, and then it was like right around post number 100. I think that background of thinking about storytelling and critical thinking I'm always curious about the why. Like, why is something happening? Why are people interested in this certain thing? And I started transitioning my posts on my blog, not just from, reviews or writing about homebrewing adventures, to trying to explore as best as I could aspects of the beer industry in a very specific socio-cultural and, as best I could, data-driven way. So like some of the early data-focused posts that I had, I would be taking ratings information that would include, the actual number value that people assign to a beer, along with ABV, IBU, ingredients. And I would try to crunch those aspects, those numbers, as best I could, to essentially come to reasoning about what's happening in beer right now. And so that got me following a host of beer news websites.
That's a dangerous rabbit hole to find yourself going down.
I am digging in the rabbit hole myself right now. I'm part of the problem.
I've got you saved my bookmarks, Bar. Thank you for that. But it sounds like you were able to take that journalistic background and some of that training that you had and really apply it to an industry that didn't at the time have a whole lot of genuine journalism, and especially data is still relatively hard to find in this industry. At the time, it was almost non-existent.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, that was my into what eventually got me into freelancing, because through my blog, I ended up meeting John Hall, a longtime newspaper reporter and writing about beer. I met him when he was editor at All About Beer magazine, through my blog. And I think very much so. It was also like I couldn't have imagined a better experience getting into the world of beer than working with John and, John Page, who is also an editor, Ken Weaver, who's got one of the smartest kind of like analytical tasting minds I think I've ever met. Like, the crew that I interacted with at All About Beer are some of the best people that I've met in beer, but also just like really, really great writers and journalists. And I think it was because exactly what you're talking about is I had this background in journalism. I was writing in a way about beer that not a lot of people were. And that kind of, by a happy accident, got my foot in the door with All About Beer, which begat a host of other publications as well, including Good Beer Hunting.
So how did you wind up linking up with Michael on Good Beer Hunting, and how did that transition into a more full-time opportunity?
Yeah, luck, honestly. So I had been working, because
at least you're honest.
Well, it's a lot of this. I really do feel like it's luck, because this was just a hobby. It was just something fun for me to do in my spare time, which has turned into something that has been fruitful, personally and professionally. And so I do feel really lucky in like the opportunities I've had, like to travel the world or make really good friends or become a better writer because of this. And I had been writing with All About Beer. I started in 2015 with All About Beer. And probably about a year and a half later, I had met Ben Keane, who was editor at BeerAdvocate magazine. And so I started doing some writing for BeerAdvocate magazine as well. And I think it was the Philadelphia Craft Brewers Conference, which I think it might have been 2016. That's when I met Michael Kaiser for the first time. He had been reading some of my work and asked if I wanted to meet up while we were both in Philadelphia. and kind of gave me the pitch on what he was trying to do with Good Beer Hunting, which had been around for a while at that point, because he was just looking to expand the roster of writers, especially some folks who might be able to bring new perspectives to what they were doing already. And so I spent an evening hanging out with Michael. He invited pitches to him and Austin Ray, who was the main news editor at the time. And then I started pitching him ideas. And I think the first story I wrote for Good Beer Hunting was it was about the rise, value, and challenges faced by own premise breweries, tap room only breweries, which in 2016 was kind of
Still
like this unicorn thing, right? But it became the lifeblood of the small brewery business in the U.S. And, ironically and unfortunately enough, is now at the center of the challenges that a lot of businesses face when you can't have people gathered in a physical location right now during COVID.